Welcome to Econ Thoughts, the podcast of the Society of Professional Economists. I'm your host, Filippo and Adam, and I'm pleased to have as guest speaker today, Adam Posen. Adam is the president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics and has been there since 2013. But previously held a number of very distinguished roles, including member of the MPC at the Bank of England, but he also worked at the Fed. Adam, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Filippo.
And good. So I grew up in the 80s and the 90s, and it was in the heyday of globalization at the time,
Right.
and free trade expanded. And even in those days, there were no lack of critics. And numerous times we saw the term books and papers trying to explain and support free trade and globalization. We are in different days today. And it seems that the globalization and also the principle of free trade are a little bit under pressure and under stress. And we see that we are a bit more in need of defending globalization. And we see the work that you and your colleagues do at the Peterson Institute actually is in kind of that kind of a work of defending,
Yes.
kind of supporting
Thank
free
you.
trade. But we also saw some books more recently, kind of one of them actually was published very few days ago. It was called Defending Globalization, edited by Scott Lincicome at the Cato, and they had a number of other people writing essays. So it seems that we are in need actually of doing that work again. And the main reason is we saw a lot of increase in talk and also in tariffs and in measures that kind of trying to block or impede or put kind of some obstacles onto free trade. But also there is a lot of discussion around potentially the peaking of trade as a percent of GDP. Even though in absolute terms, we see that trade actually, even between the US and China, is still kind of to a certain extent increasing, at least in goods. So to set the scene, could you help us, Adam, a little bit to talk about where are we at the moment? Are we in a period of deglobalization, or as some people call it, globalization? Even if it's a kind of a very bit of a funny terms, but can you help us a little bit to understand actually where we are before we get started in the debate about what is to come in 2025?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for calling out my colleagues at Peterson and elsewhere who are trying to make the fact-based case. I have my own funny term that I keep hoping will catch on. I think what we're experiencing is the corrosion of globalization. The idea being not it's one trend, it stops, it reverses, it goes forward slowly, but that the globalization is a multi-layered fabric. It's trade, it's investment, it's flows of people, it's flows of ideas, it's flows of capital. It's and it is not growing or shrinking uniformly across the world. There are places in Asia, there are places in Europe where global economic integration is deepening, even as the US and China in their own ways are withdrawing. And so when I think about it as corrosion, that in some places there are holes in the fabric, or the fabric is more brittle, less resilient, but it's still there. Now, the way to think about it, though, is we knit that fabric because we wanted it. It helps bring us together. It helps keep us warm. And so trying to stop the corrosion is worthwhile.
Yeah. And it's interesting point about kind of we wanted it. And the reason why kind of there has been this corrosion, is it because we stopped believing in the benefits, or are because there is a misperception about the benefits? So people don't really understand actually what the benefits are. Is it kind of a case that, well, actually we don't think is good anymore, or actually we don't actually realize how good it is?
I think it's more the latter. We don't realize how good it is, but as the question always is when you go from economics to politics, who's we? So internationalists, globalists, academic types like you and me, we probably enjoy it. Where the biggest misperception seems to be is from people who insist that their lives have been made worse by globalization. And the number of people for whom we can directly attribute that is quite low. And it's not clear, while they should have their sympathies if it involves job loss or decline of their communities, they should have sympathies, help, and support, frankly. But it's not clear that that happening because of globalization is any different than that happening because of technological change or changes in people's tastes or climate change. Moreover, it's not clear you can even disentangle those. In some ways, the technology and globalization go together. And if you attack globalization, you're sort of attacking technological progress. Again, not every time, every moment. So I think there's a mismatch between a lot of popular feelings and what the reality is. But if I can make a second point, as we've seen throughout politics in Europe, throughout Brexit and other politics in the UK, as we've seen in the US, it's not, politicians get very upset and talk about trade, particularly with respect to China. But in the polling data, in people's, when you ask them what matters to them, trade doesn't come up very much. On the other hand, immigration and the management of immigration does seem to really matter to a lot of voters, and in ways that maybe as an economist, I don't think are justified, but nonetheless, it's their right. But so again, I think we need to unpack it a little. It's not necessarily trade as much as immigration. It's not necessarily harms from trade as fears of change. It's not quite as open and shut as some politicians want to make it out to be.
Yeah, no, it's a very valid point because you mentioned earlier on in terms of what globalization is, and you mentioned that it is about kind of ideas, it is about goods, it's about services, but also people, movement on people. It sounds like, as you said, politically, it's the movement of people that tend to generate the most adverse reaction, and maybe to a certain extent is the one that actually kind of damage the principle of trade. So because people don't like immigration, so that they might actually link immigration to trade, and therefore they become a little bit more protectionist because of the immigration. So in a sense, do you think that if a better immigration policy were in place, people will also start looking at trade and tariff in a different way?
An interesting idea. It's plausible. Um, I don't want to duck or claim that there aren't people who are directly opposed to trade or to immigration, but I do think it's important to see, as a lot of people are now looking at the US election, or as the Prime Minister Keir Starmer just said in a speech, it's about the failure in some ways of the center left and the elites, of which I supposedly am part, and you too, um, to deliver, and spending a little too much time in sort of sanctimonious process and not enough time on what people care about. And so again, immigration is a hot button issue. But we had the pleasant surprise in the UK that when immigration was curtailed from Europe, actually it went up from a bunch of
Yeah.
countries around the world and seems to have been politically accepted. Um, so I think again, it's part of, at least in the US, but I also think in UK and elsewhere in Europe, is the sense that not handling large surges of immigration well reflects a either lack of competence or lack of appropriate concern by the politicians. So again, is it globalization? Is it not? So your idea is intriguing, Filippo, that maybe if we were better on immigration, in some sense, we would be better on trade. I think it's more broadly, if we were better, period, we would get the technocrats would get more deference rather
Yeah.
than getting harassed.
That's possible. That's possible, and I think, in a sense, a better immigration policy is probably good for many other reasons as well. The other point that you mentioned earlier on was about China, and not all of them, but some of the more critics of, let's say, free trade or open trade is they're talking about that China kind of has not behaved according to the rules. That's one element. And therefore, if they don't behave according to the rules, it's okay actually to put some restriction and tariffs on China. And the other one was related to potentially more of a national security argument. Now, we all know that sometimes national security is used and misused actually to do other kind of protectionist or tariff policies. But do you think there is a case to say that actually some tariffs against China are kind of valid because of either China kind of potentially policy that they introduce, but also in terms of national security?
I think one has to think about a two-part argument here. The first is, what is it you're trying to achieve with economic policies towards China? And the second is whether it'll work.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the talk, particularly in the US, where the anti-China feeling is so strong in the political class across both parties, frankly. It's saying, well, national security is more important than economics. Well, in some sense, that's banal. That's true. Um, but so the question is, what are you trying to achieve? If your goal is to reduce China as a threat in some sense, leaving aside the question whether they really are a
Mm-hmm.
threat, it's not clear that weakening your own economy or making them less dependent on your economy or less engaged with your economy is a good idea. And similarly, if your goal is to change China's behavior, it's not clear that certain economic measures actually get the results you want. So, it may be that your goal is for moral political reasons. So the US passed a law, and I know there are similar measures in Europe, in the UK, not to take goods from the Uyghur territories in China because China has been oppressing Muslim Uyghurs and putting them into forced labor and putting them into camps. And this is a crime, and we may not want to be part of that crime. But that's not had any effect, as far as I know, on the number of Uyghurs being oppressed by China. So again, it's you can at some broad level say national security is more important than economics. And you can certainly say that the Chinese Communist Party is engaging in threatening or even evil behaviors. But the question is, do these economic measures actually get those behaviors to change or make the US safer or the UK safer? And that's where I think there's a lot of foolish thinking. I mean, there may be no. I was asked to give a lecture at the U.S. National War College. Actually, I've given it now a couple times, a couple of years in a row.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, my message to them is, sadly, there's a reason all you military people are still employed. And it may be that all these politicians who want to substitute economic measures for military action. I don't mean necessarily war, but I mean deterrence or
Yeah.
pressure or forward basing or various other things. It may be that economics can't substitute for that. So if you view China as a threat, it may be you have to engage in threatening, deterrent, or denial military action rather than economic action.
Yeah. And I think it would probably take kind of that particular kind of strategic challenge to a different level. Um, I mean, the other argument, and I'm trying to go through the list of the possible arguments that always been made
There's a
at the
long
time.
list.
There is a
Some are
lot of
good,
it.
some are not.
And I think is around manufacturing particularly, and kind of this is more about in particularly in the current incoming Trump administration around the America First, but trying to revive the manufacturing base. Now you see that argument to a certain extent in Europe as well. It's either to protect or revive it. Now we see some analysis from some kind of economists that say that there is some truth to it and it could potentially revive it, but though I would probably say, and the majority or the ones that I kind of you see is more that it hasn't probably will not have a much of an impact. Having said that, it could have an impact in certain regions, and politically the regions might be very important. Based on the work that you've done, kind of do you see any kind of consequence if you start putting a lot of tariffs and be more protectionist? Would lead to any kind of revival of manufacturing, or is it at the end of the day it's a little bit of a foolish error, and then in the end you end up damaging just your economy without getting any of the benefits?
I think it's mostly the latter. There's an argument. The Peterson Institute published 30 years ago, a little more than 30 years ago, a book by Laura Tyson before she took on a cabinet role in the Clinton administration called Who's Bashing Whom? And it tried to operationalize some of the Krugman-Heltman arguments about strategic trade theory to say, okay, there are certain industries where you want to
Mm-hmm.
support having an entry. You want an industrial policy, even more than protection. You want an industrial policy to make sure you have a role and it's not dominated. And there are various arguments going back to Alexander Hamilton and Friedrich List and more sophisticated versions more recently about industrial policy combined with trade protection. The problem is, as always, how many cases does this really fit? So Tyson is rightly proud that Airbus came out to compete with Boeing, and so we're not just Airbus and Boeing. And I think I would totally agree that was a wise thing. And you don't want, unfortunately, the economics need to be there's only room for one and a half profitable airframe makers, but you don't want there to be only one.
Yeah.
But and now we have semiconductor chips, and for a very different, very specific set of reasons that the world became enormously dependent on the production of certain chips in one specific location. And so, until you can diversify away from that, or as a measure to diversify away from that, you need an industrial policy. But that's two examples out of 40 years across the whole range of the economy. And it's not that frequent or compelling. I'm very proud to say we published another book recently, the Peterson Institute by Robert Lawrence, called Behind the Curve, which is a very new, brilliant look at the fate of manufacturing as a source of jobs, of so-called good jobs in the West and in East Asia. And basically, Robert makes, I think, a very persuasive case that because of technology, because of changing tastes, that you're just not going to get the kind of employment for less educated, formally educated, skilled, but not formally educated workers out of manufacturing that you did 100 years ago or 70 years ago. And that's just a reality. So then you can say, well, we're going to fight over the remaining shrinking pie of employment. But then you get into basically an arms race, and it gets very expensive in terms of how much you're spending per job. So there's so much attention paid to manufacturing and manufacturing employment, and in Germany right now, there's incredible turmoil and political angst over the fact that the German auto industry is fundamentally in trouble. And again, I don't want to make light of human beings adapting to this. We want to help human beings adapt, but the fact that these limited minority of total jobs in the economy, which are generally overstated because not everybody who works for VW or works for Ford is actually a manufacturing worker, shouldn't be driving the entire economic policy of a major economy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think there was a lot of debate around, actually, as you said, is how do you help people that are actually displaced? As you said, there are certain, whether it's technology, mostly technology, and a little bit of trade as well, there are some manufacturing kind of jobs which are lost. How do you help and facilitate transition for those workers? And I think maybe that's an area where government, to a certain extent, may have failed actually to kind of introduce appropriate policy actually for that. And the question is, how do you get better at that if there is?
Yeah, and of course, this is something that economists, at least progressive or open-minded economists, have repeatedly come back to. And in the US, there was always where the welfare state is much lower. It's a share of GDP. And, this has been a recurring issue that people who would vote for trade in Congress would not fund alternatives. On the other hand, going back to stuff Danny Roderick was pointing out 30, 40 years ago as well, right? In Germany and France, there's no shortage of the welfare state. It might be slightly less generous than it once was, but it's, health, housing, pension, college education for your kids, all those things that in the US you worry about, those do exist. So, but I think the other part of it is that we have seen through the years, and I tried to make this point in an article called The Price of Nostalgia a few years ago. We've seen through the years incredibly persistent regional differences in income and employment. So you think about Southern Italy, you think about the
Yep.
so-called Deep South in the US, or West Virginia and Appalachia. You think about Northern England. You think about, boom, 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 boom. And despite, in some cases, massive government transfers for a very long period, um, you don't see catch up. And in
Mm,
fact, you have to cope with the dynamic that anybody who's young or healthy or skilled leaves, and what remains gets hollowed out and has mostly elderly or unhealthy people left. The extreme of this case in the US is Puerto Rico,
yeah.
where, you know, the it's not that the US had treated Puerto Rico that well, but anyway, but you have a problem that anybody who's young and mobile, or even middle-aged and mobile, goes to Florida, goes to the U.S., and what's left in Puerto Rico is, in terms of employment and growth, is weakened. So we can identify that problem, but I think a lot of economists from the trade side of things don't always appreciate how persistent some of these geographic income differentials and employment differentials are.
Yeah, absolutely. Coming from Italy, obviously, I can kind of
Yes.
familiarize with that concept a lot in terms of the problems that the south of the country had over the years. But you mentioned earlier on in terms of how do you mitigate, and obviously you mentioned about the size of government and government transfer and wealth, but I think probably is less about government intervention and welfare and supporting is potentially finding different job opportunities because there is a difference for somebody that loses a job to go on the kind of the support from government than actually finding a different job. So it's about how do you create alternative jobs
Yeah,
because it's a bit
yeah.
more
But
difficult.
this is where and going back to that article I wrote and other things since, this is where I come off as probably more of a free market callous economist than I usually do. An awful lot of people lose jobs.
Yeah.
In the US, we have a workforce of 155, 160 million people. And on the order of 40 to 60 million people change jobs every year. Now, some of those are just young people or old people dropping out. And some of that's voluntary, quits rates or go up. But even if you take a third of it, it's 15 to 20 million people a year
Mhm.
lose jobs involuntarily in some form or another. And they get on with their lives. And again, I want there to be unemployment insurance. I'd love to spend money like the Danes do on so-called active labor market
Yeah.
policies that help people move, help people find new jobs. But the reality is there's less churn in Europe, and there's somewhat in between amounts of churn in the UK, and churn meaning the number of people who change jobs or lose jobs in a given year. But the idea that we don't accept as a society that millions of people every year, a huge share of the workforce, are going to have involuntary job loss is just wrong. And so this sort of waking up and suddenly saying, oh my God, we have to worry about these people who are displaced. Well, sure, we should. But the idea that it's something new or worse now is actually not true. And so again, this goes back to where we started, Filippo. I mean, the perceptions versus data
Yeah.
is very difficult to figure out how to navigate. So we have in polling data and voting data in the culture in the US, there's constant talk about all these indebted millennials and young people, Generation Z, and they don't have jobs in this. But when you look at the data, they actually have a high level of labor force
Mhm.
participation. They tend to stay at jobs longer than some of the older generational cadres do. Their income and even their assets, as far as the data shows, on average, and in fact, not just on average, but by income quintile, is doing as well or better than previous generations. And yet there is this extremely strong perception that has voiced politically that these generations are somehow more indebted, more fragile, more vulnerable. And again, it's not my place to tell people they don't feel what they feel, but it is our place as professional economists, to go with your name of your society, to say, well, that's not what the data is telling us. So something else is at work here.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I was about to jump in and say exactly that, because I will be with you in terms of being, as your word, kind of the callous free market economy. But it seems that sometimes actually these arguments use economics as a little bit of an excuse or kind of for other problems. And I think in a
Right.
lot of the situation is not necessarily kind of economics, not income. Even the rise of populism, a lot of people put it down to issues related to joblessness or even income inequality back in the mid-teens. But I think there were other issues, more cultural issues that were at play. And I think that might view that it's easier actually to point to some economic data because it's something that you can actually use, only use in terms of data. But the reality is there's something deeper kind of behind it. And obviously something a bit outside the discussion today. So let me just pivot, if I may. We talked a little bit about where we kind of were in the past, how we got here, and the situation now. But let's look at the 2025. Obviously, new US administration coming in on the 20th of January, and has made, and that kind of administration and other kind of President-elect Trump or some of the appointees have made announcement about increasing in tariffs and different kind of trade policies. What's your expectation for what will happen in January? So are kind of the tariffs, the 20%, 10%, 60%, 100%, I think there is a different kind of percentage every day almost. Are they happening? Will they happen in the way they've been described now? Will it be fast? Will it be a negotiation? Will it take a month, one day? So what's your expectation actually? What will happen in January?
So let me start with reminding everyone or explaining to everyone something about the current American political system, which is the American president has an enormous amount of what we call executive authority, meaning they can issue what are executive orders, change the implementation or rulings of various agencies without needing legislation through Congress. And President Trump, in his first term, did a huge amount of tariffs through his own authority without going to Congress. And then President Biden maintained the tariffs, and the Democrats didn't, on a legal basis, challenge the tariffs. In fact, they wanted many of them. So now we've got 8+ years of precedent that the president can exercise, going back to something you said earlier, spurious national security claims or more legitimate anti-dumping claims or various arbitrary ways just to impose tariffs. So legally, at present, the American president could just start putting on tariffs day one when he takes office.
Yeah.
So then, as you say, the question is, where does it go? Now, I've been forecasting for several months two aspects: that China, which is no surprise, but also Mexico, were going to get hit very hard very early. And it turned out that through his pseudo tweet, Trump went after them even earlier than I thought. And I think the China reasons are obvious, whether good or not, but the Mexico, I think it's partly that President-elect Trump wants to make an example of somebody and show that he's willing to disregard pre-existing trade agreements, even ones he negotiated, like USMCA, or he signed, and that he's willing to tie a lot of issues that are not traditionally trade issues, like migration and drugs and crime or national security, to trade in a very explicit way. And so, but on the other hand, there was all this talk about a so-called across-the-board tariffs, which would be much more harmful to the economy, frankly, to the US economy, to the world economy, to the system. And I was more inclined to believe that those would be more threatened than implemented. And while my forecast on China and Mexico turns out to be right, my forecast on the across-the-board tariffs is much more uncertain in terms of what's going to happen. So there are a number of people, including the nominee to be Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, and others who have said these tariffs are just, I think Bessent said something like maximalist negotiating position.
Yeah.
That you threaten the tariffs and you threaten them at a high level and you get concessions. And then we can get into what those concessions are. And so my belief, and then there are specific countries, the UK is one, Japan's another, probably South Korea, probably Australia, possibly some members of the European Union, where there's a combined foreign policy economic incentive for the Trump administration to make an early deal and exempt those countries from whatever tariffs are
Yeah.
coming in return for promises of certain investment or purchases of US weapons or purchases of US airplanes or purchases of US natural gas. And also, and this is the sticky part, agreement by these countries' governments to join the US in being anti-China in certain ways. That's what I think is likely to happen. The reason I'm more uncertain now is I've been hearing literally in just the last few days that the Trump administration is preparing to link the across-the-board tariffs as part of their budget proposal. Now, there are among many, there are two reasonable reasons why they might do this. The first is they are trying to make the case that they're going to get a significant amount of tax revenues from the tariffs, and therefore, when the Congress is voting and scoring on the budget, they should take the tariff revenues, into account. And that's legally, formally easier to do if you include it in the same bill. The second reason is, again, if you accept their initial premise that you want a big goal is to prevent China from getting to export stuff to the US, is if you do an across the board tariff, then stuff can't come from China transshipped somewhere else. Yeah. Again, I think both of these arguments have major flaws. But anyway, taking those as given, it's not unreasonable for them to attach the tariffs to a bill in Congress, the budget bill. And that has the additional advantage in the sense of legitimacy that it's not just the president signing off the tariffs and they could be withdrawn through the president at any time, but then the representatives in Congress pass it. So if that's the case, then the timing's different. Then the budget bill probably goes to Congress end of February, early March, and could take anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 months to pass. And presumably during that period, the Trump administration would be going to various countries and saying, if you want to be exempted,
negotiate now.
Negotiate now.
Yeah.
And so my initial forecast was something of that exempted negotiated now, but a much looser sort of vague threat of the future tariffs across the board and very harsh tariffs on China and Mexico very quickly. The second part of that forecast still seems valid. The first part of that forecast now might be switched to it's a formal announcement as part of the budget process, and so therefore countries have 3 to 4 months to negotiate, and that's the ticking time bomb.
Yeah, I mean, I said it's an interesting kind of scenario, and I can see the value of attaching it to the budget bill. Obviously, as you said, it gives a little bit more stability and longevity. But at the same time, it becomes kind of a little bit a hostage to Congress politics. Absolutely. Because you need, I mean, the majority in the House is the smallest ever. I believe at the moment, the Republicans only have 219 or 220 kind of seats. So it's one or two people kind of dropping off might actually not secure that budget to pass. Though there is more kind of unanimity in the House, but on the Senate also you need, obviously for budget reconciliation, you still need 50 votes, and one or two senators, well, obviously there's a majority of 3 at the moment, might drop out. So in a sense, it makes it more difficult to pass. So it might be that strategy could take even longer.
Your underlying logic's okay, but your specific parameterization for the sequence, I don't think is right. So let me be less abstract. I don't think it will be difficult to pass.
Okay.
So there are a couple Republican senators and possibly a couple Republican House members who are more traditional moderate conservatives, but also just have a game theoretic incentive like Senator Manchin had in the previous administration against the Democratic majority to try to extract something before they vote in favor. But I really doubt that drawing the line on tariffs is where
Okay.
they're going, is where they're going to threaten. I think it's going to be on other things. Um, but I do think, in line with what you're saying, there is this aspect of, do you want to do it through Congress or not? Now, well, from what we know and has been reported on about Trump's governing style, he would probably much more like to have control,
Yeah.
um, and not yield it to Congress, and then not have to share credit with Congress, but also to be less dismissive. Then in negotiations, he can calibrate more finely.
Yeah.
Um, but another piece of legislation making its way through Congress that may get passed very early in 2025 is what's called revoking PNTR for China.
Yeah.
PNTR is Washington speak for most favored nation status, treating
Yeah.
treating China as a normal WTO member. And that was granted, so-called permanent normal trading relations was granted in 1999, 2000. And that was necessary to let China into the WTO, basically. Um, there's huge support in both parties in both houses of Congress to pass a bill that would revoke this. And revoking it would mean either you just immediately put the tariffs up to Smoot-Hawley levels on China, or it means that every year you have to renew China getting treated with most favored nation status. Now, this is completely destructive to the WTO and the world trading system. Leave that aside. There is precedent from the trade battles with Japan, which were far less hostile and far less crushing. But anyway, the trade battles with Japan in the 80s and 90s, and a little bit less so with Europe, where presidents would say, look, Congress wants to kill you economically. I'm the only one who can stop it by either vetoing it or making it so it's dependent on me. So therefore, give me something. And so I could very well see this bill making progress through Congress quickly to revoke China's trade
Yeah.
status. And then Trump saying to President Xi, or his emissary saying to Xi's emissary, uh, only I can prevent Congress from doing this. Give me something. So that's another wrinkle in the timeline here.
Okay, that's interesting. So it doesn't seem there is too much optimism in your scenario about the first few months. It seems it's going to be quite an aggressive kind of position straight away. I mean, the Mexico one is an interesting one because I would agree with you on the China that those kind of on your scenario, but the Mexico one, I thought it was more of a similar negotiating position. Obviously, you got USMCA kind of renegotiation in 2026, I believe. So, isn't that the starting gun of the negotiation, or you actually think that there is seriousness in the threat of the putting tariffs, even if against actually the current terms of USMCA?
No, I think the tariffs with Mexico are a negotiating
Yeah,
tool, but they are in the specific case of Mexico. And given the fact that a review of USMCA, which I call NAFTA 0.8, is required
yeah,
by roughly a year and a half from now, um, it's a very, very credible threat, and it's a
yeah.
very harmful threat in a way that tariff threats, even for China or 10% tariffs across the board, are not for others.
Okay.
And it's paired with the sad historical situation, as somebody once said, poor Mexico, so close to the US, so far from God, that the US is frankly not shy about making police or even military interventions in Mexico. The US can be very unilateral in its treatment of migrants who come not literally from Mexico, but through Mexico. The current Mexican government, following on the AMLO government, Sheinbaum government, following on the AMLO government, has issues with the U.S. over ownership in the energy industry and the new proposals of the judiciary. There's issues of crime and so you just go down the
Yeah.
laundry list. So is the outcome that there's going to be huge tariffs? Maybe not, but the outcome will be something where the revised, I'm sad to say, and I hope I'm wrong, but the outcome is, in my view, going to be a revised downward USMCA.
Okay.
So if the USMCA was NAFTA 0.8, whatever the next one's going to be called is going to be USMCA 0.5. It's going to have very high rules of origin requirements and various restrictions, making it much less viable for auto industry to trade from Mexico into the US. It's going to put additional restrictions on Mexico's ability to attract foreign investment, particularly from China. It's going to impose burdens on Mexico. And so whether or not it's specifically tariffs, there will be trade barriers,
Yeah.
there will be impositions by the US.
Okay. Well, thank you. Well, something obviously to be monitored and checked in the next few months in 2025. I think we're running short on time, so let me just pivot again and give you one last question. Obviously, you've been working both at the Bank of England and the Fed, so let's actually have a last few minutes on monetary policy and the Fed. What's your kind of expectation for the Fed in 2025? Obviously, the market has moved around a little bit over the last few weeks in terms of how many cuts actually should we expect. Will it continue? Obviously, it's data dependent, so it will depend a little bit about the rate of inflation or how it develops over the next few weeks. So what do you expect? What's your kind of terminal rate for 2025? Do we expect still kind of a gradual slow decrease or kind of a pause? So what do you think the Fed will do also in the context of potential friction with the White House?
So I've been on the record, Filippo, for more than 6 months, since basically April of 2024, more vocally since June, that I think the Fed was making a mistake on the pure economics, even before we get to Trump versus Harris, that the Fed was overestimating how tight they were, underestimating R-star, underestimating the resiliency of the US economy, overestimating how much monetary tightening was being transmitted. And I've said this for a while. And so my forecast has been that, yes, the Fed would cut rates this fall, but by, say, March of 2025, they would stop cutting rates. And by third quarter of 2025, they would be hiking. And this is partly because of the economic measures I just said, but also because whether it was going to be Harris or Trump, you were going to see more fiscal expansion. You were going to see more tariffs. You were going to see other things that are inflationary. And so worse under Trump, that they would be bigger magnitude worse, but that they would be in the same direction if Harris had won. And so to me, if Trump is going to come in and do all the things he says, or some subset of them in a meaningful way, and in particular, one thing we haven't spoken about, because the international implications beyond Mexico are not that big, but if the Trump administration ends up deporting migrant workers or massively deterring the inflow of migrant workers, that's also going to be inflationary. And that's, in fact, stagflationary. That's a negative supply shock for the US. Again, Harris would not have been deporting large numbers of workers, but she would have continued the recent Biden policy of restricting the inflow. So that, again, would be inflationary. So just to say we were already on a path that the Fed was not as tight and inflation was not as low as they thought, and that whoever was going to win the policies were going to be more inflationary. Now, it's possible they get bailed out, the Fed and the US gets bailed out because the Trump people massively overdo it on the deportation immigration restriction, and that causes a recession. It's also possible they get bailed out because there's strong evidence that productivity growth has accelerated in a sustained way. It's not for sure yet, it never is, but it looks like that. And that you could end up with a productivity acceleration that offsets these other inflationary things, and you don't have it. But to me, the modal case is the Fed stops cutting. Maybe they do one more in January, they do one in December, but it's done by March, and then starts hiking by the second half of 2025.
Oh, very interesting. And that puts it definitely out of the consensus view that the EDC is in the market. So it'll be interesting to see who's right. And I argue a point about they get bailed out. One of them is a negative bailout with a recession. Right. The productivity boom is a positive bailout. So if they get bailed out, I hope it's a positive and not productivity boom. Definitely.
Of course. So do I. But I meant bailed out in the sense of not having inflation and not having to raise rates.
Exactly. No, I understand that. Well, Adam, has been fantastic. And with our last kind of a little bit of a prediction, we got something to look forward to in the future to see actually who's right and who's wrong on the Fed rates. But thank you very much for being on our show. We'll definitely put some of the links to some of the work you mentioned earlier on, particularly the work from the Peterson, which I have to
Thank you.
say, for all our listeners, you should definitely check it out. It's one of my favorite kind of places to get the economics news. So thank you all for the great work you're doing there. And enjoy your travels back to the United States. I believe you're in London today. And thank you again for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Filippo, and to SPE, and look forward to hearing more from you and your members as well. Bye-bye.